5 years. That's how long it had been since I'd last spoken to my mother, until today. Out of nowhere, my phone lit up with her name, and a part of me hesitated before answering. I already knew what this was about. She needed something. And I was right. Her voice was softer than I remembered, almost pleading as she told me my sister, Melissa, and her husband had suffered a terrible tragedy. She needed my help. My help! The irony nearly made me laugh. Because the man my sister married, the one she now needed saving from, was supposed to be my husband. Let's rewind. Melissa, my younger sister, had always had a way of getting what she wanted. And on the night of my engagement to Lucas, she decided she wanted him. It was supposed to be the happiest night of my life, a beautiful celebration with the man I had loved for nearly 5 years. But that illusion shattered the moment I stepped into the backyard for some fresh air and stumbled upon a scene straight out of my worst nightmare. There they were. Melissa and Lucas. Tangled together in a passionate embrace, oblivious to the world around them. For a few agonizing seconds, they didn't even see me. I stood frozen, my heart slamming against my ribs, my breath catching in my throat. And when they finally noticed me, when Melissa's guilty eyes met mine, it was already too late. I turned and ran, my legs moving on instinct, my mind refusing to process what I had just seen. I barely remembered throwing myself into my car, my fingers trembling as I gripped the wheel, driving aimlessly until I reached a hotel. Then, the text started. Melissa was so sorry. But she was in love with Lucas. And apparently, she had been for a long time. Then came Lucas' message, his pathetic attempt at an explanation. He told me he had proposed to me as a last-ditch effort to rid himself of his feelings for Melissa, hoping that committing to me would make her disappear from his mind. But it had only made him want her more. And then came the final blow, he called me a placeholder. A stepping stone to the woman he was truly meant to be with. I stayed in that hotel for days, drowning in disbelief, trying, and failing, to convince myself that this was some cruel joke. But reality has a way of sinking in, no matter how hard you try to escape it. Eventually, I had to return home, collect my things, and salvage what little remained of my life. But nothing could have prepared me for what awaited me when I stepped through that front door. My family had welcomed Lucas with open arms. Not only had they let him stay in our home, but they were all smiles, acting as if nothing had happened. As if my world hadn't just crumbled at their feet. My mother was the first to embrace me, followed by my father, my aunt, every single one of them playing the role of a loving, supportive family. Even Melissa had the audacity to throw her arms around me, her eyes shimmering with fake tears. I felt like I was suffocating, like I had walked into some twisted alternate reality where betrayal was met with applause. And then, Lucas spoke. "There's no need for you to leave," he said casually. "I've already packed my stuff. I'll be moving in with Melissa." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And then I saw it, the subtle, almost proud smiles on my family's faces. My mother, my father, my aunt, all of them looking at me like I was the one overreacting. When I finally found my voice, I demanded to know what they were so damn happy about. Melissa had just destroyed my engagement, what was there to celebrate? My mother sighed, as if I was some petulant child throwing a tantrum. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we can accept the future. And the future has Melissa and Lucas together in it." Melissa, standing beside Lucas, nodded solemnly, playing the part of the regretful sister. "I never meant to hurt you," she murmured. "But we're in love. We always have been." And then, as if to drive the knife even deeper, they kissed. Right in front of me. My mother even wiped away a tear, as if this was some tragic love story instead of a disgusting betrayal. I snapped. I told them this wasn't a touching romance, it was a disgrace. And to my utter disbelief, my family turned on me. They accused me of being selfish, of making this about me instead of celebrating Melissa's happiness. My father scolded me, telling me to grow up because these things happen. He actually wanted me to be happy that my sister had found her soulmate. That was it. That was my breaking point. I told them all to get the hell out of my house. And when they refused, when they had the audacity to look offended, I stormed into my room, grabbed whatever I could carry, and left. I didn't even spare them a second glance. And I never looked back. For weeks, they tried to reach me. Calls, texts, voicemails. I ignored them all. Then, as if to twist the knife one last time, I received an invitation to Melissa and Lucas' wedding. I didn't even dignify it with a response. Most of my friends refused to attend in solidarity, and even a few relatives cut ties with my family after learning the truth. And now, after 5 years of silence, my mother had the nerve to call me, begging for help. Melissa's perfect marriage had crumbled, and suddenly, I was supposed to save her. I almost laughed. Because while they had spent the past 5 years trying to justify their betrayal, I had been busy. Building a life. A life so good that I made sure they saw every bit of it. I never blocked them. I wanted them to see. I wanted them to know that I was thriving. Without them. I still seethed with a burning jealousy, a petty flame, perhaps, but the only ember I had left after they had completely ruined me. Until just recently, I had been utterly oblivious to what they'd been scheming over these past few years. 4 days ago, my phone rang from an unknown number. When I answered, I instantly recognized my mother's trembling voice on the other end. I nearly hung up, yet she pleaded with a desperate urgency for just one chance to speak. She claimed they were drowning in trouble, and my own humanity forced me to listen, if only for a few minutes. She explained that Melissa and Lucas had launched a business a couple of years ago, a venture that was now floundering miserably. Investors were abandoning ship because the profits never materialized. They had borrowed even more money, which only plunged them deeper into debt, with predatory creditors circling like relentless sharks. Everyone, from disgruntled employees to furious investors and even the very people they had borrowed from, was on their tail. Knowing I lived a life of luxury, my mother begged me, her final lifeline, to loan nearly $75,000 so they could settle their debts. I demanded to know why Melissa hadn't reached out herself, and why my mother was forced to speak for her. My mother sighed, explaining that Melissa and Lucas had instructed her not to approach me at all. Apparently, they still feared the memory of what had happened 5 years ago. Melissa hadn't wanted me to learn any of their secrets or accept help from me. And with no one else capable of pulling out such a hefty sum on short notice, my mother felt she had no option but to call me. By then, months had slipped by, and Melissa and Lucas were struggling even to put food on the table. My parents, and even Lucas's own family, had done all they could, yet it wasn't nearly enough to secure their future. With most of our kin retired, including Lucas's parents, my mother had no choice but to turn to me. I had the means to help, but my heart was closed. Melissa was right, in a twisted way, for not contacting me. The moment they betrayed me, they forfeited any right to make demands. I told my mother plainly that I couldn't, and wouldn't, help them. Her voice cracked with hurt as she accused me of cruelty, urging me to consider the family. I reminded her that neither Melissa nor Lucas had ever thought of me when their affair unfolded, nor had my family considered my feelings while lavishing support on them. I had worked too hard to reach where I am today to casually drop $75,000 on 2 people who didn't deserve it. Then my mother's tears flowed over the phone as she lamented that she'd never imagined I'd turned so cold-hearted, warning that Melissa and Lucas would face dire consequences if I didn't step in. I simply said it was too bad, I couldn't help, and ended the call. Since that moment, my mother has bombarded me with texts every hour, pleading for me to reconsider and at least think of my sister. She insisted this wasn't a time for petty revenge but a genuine crisis, one that I would regret ignoring. Yet, I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry. After all, I wasn't about to rescue my sister financially after she'd stolen my fiancé 5 years ago. Labeled selfish and even an asshole by those who knew the full story, I eventually blocked my family. I hadn't cut them off before. I wanted them to see my success and perhaps feel a pang of envy, and I worried I might regret severing ties if disaster struck them. But now, I don't care. I should have done it 5 years ago. What once might have seemed petty now appears as nothing more than logical. They'd already wasted an obscene amount of money, and I'm convinced that even if I handed over $75,000, they'd never repay a cent. $75,000 isn't pocket change. Even if I'm well off, I can't simply gift that sum without expecting it back. If it were a close friend, I'd insist on repayment. These people aren't dear to me, and I have no reason to trust they'd return my money. I even ran this by a few friends. They agreed I was right, not out of vengeance but because it was simply impractical to help those who had so thoroughly wronged me. Now, with my mother blocked and her guilt trips silenced, I have nothing left to worry about on that front. Then, today at work, my day took an even stranger turn. A call from my neighbor shattered any semblance of calm. A couple was outside my house, screaming for me to come out and talk. My neighbor described them as nearly deranged, yelling at my door for an entire hour and refusing to leave. I asked for a description, even though I already suspected who it was, and her words confirmed it. Melissa and Lucas were there, and I would soon have to face them. My neighbor insisted I return immediately to deal with the situation. After all, if it was Melissa and Lucas we were talking about, there was no hope for redemption. I thanked her and sped back home, determined not to let them break into my sanctuary. I arrived in about 15 minutes, just in time to catch them red-handed, trying to pick the lock on my door. I pulled up in front of my house and demanded, "What are you doing here?" I couldn't fathom what in the world they thought they were doing. In a frenzy, I fumbled for my phone to dial the police, but before I could even press a button, Lucas lunged at me like a striking panther, snatching my phone from my trembling hand. Melissa, too, glided over with unnerving calm, insisting they were there solely to talk and that they wanted nothing from me, at least not right now. But would their intentions remain as innocent as they claimed? I barked, "Make it quick, no stepping inside." I made it crystal clear, if they had something to say, it had to be hashed out in the yard. They acquiesced, and I felt a slight relief. The idea of inviting those two inside, with their palpable hostility, had never crossed my mind. Even though they repeatedly claimed they needed nothing, I couldn't shake the underlying tension that clung to every word. Yet the air crackled with anticipation for what would come next. Melissa began her tirade, revealing that my mother had filled her in about my frantic call, and how I then dismissed her follow-up text, even going so far as to block every number. According to her, my behavior was outrageously unfair. After 5 long years, I should have moved on instead of resorting to such dramatic antics merely to snag a sliver of my family's attention. But could any apology ever erase the sting of betrayal? She continued, confessing that she felt deeply insulted by my refusal to help, and that was the very reason for her visit. Melissa explained that, for now, she'd managed to cobble together enough funds, but the future loomed with an even greater financial abyss. Having already sold their house and every cherished piece of jewelry to scrape by once, she couldn't possibly repeat that desperate measure. Thus, she needed reassurance that I would be their fallback, a dependable safety net in times of crisis. Yet my heart burned with a resolve that would not be swayed. I spat back, "Under no circumstances can you count on me." I seethed with a hatred so fierce for her, and for Lucas, that I admitted it took every ounce of restraint not to strike her right then and there. My voice trembled with anger as I demanded that they simply leave me be. But their next move would test my limits even further. Then, with the audacity of a man with no shame, Lucas declared they weren't leaving until I signed a document pledging to loan them money in the future whenever they might need it. He claimed this promise would stand, even if I were forced to sign under duress. I scoffed, knowing full well that legal codes frown upon coercion, and that they were downright delusional if they thought they could manipulate me with a mere scrap of paper. But what would I do when their demands crossed every boundary? I ordered them both to get the hell out. In a move that shocked me to my core, Melissa shoved me, insisting that, as family, I owed them help, that I couldn't simply abandon my responsibilities. Her push sent a surge of fury through me, and for a moment, I nearly lost control and slapped her. I swallowed that impulse, knowing that any violence would only make matters far worse. Yet the tension surged like a rising tide, threatening to engulf us all. Instead, I snatched up the phone that had tumbled to the ground when Lucas had knocked it from my grasp, and bolted for my car. I dove into the driver's seat and sped off without glancing in the rearview mirror, my car still humming with an engine left running in my haste. I knew they weren't foolish enough to pursue me on foot, they simply lingered outside my house, an infuriating reminder of my predicament. Once I was safely at a distance, I called the police to report the disturbance, then raced back to my home just in time before the authorities arrived. But would this escape finally grant me peace? Within 20 minutes, I relayed every sordid detail to the officers, and they promptly arrested and hauled away Melissa and Lucas. I was well aware that the charges were minor and that they might easily slip away from severe punishment, but at least they were removed from my life. I wouldn't waste another precious moment on them. Yet silence soon gave way to an eerie calm. A couple of hours later, not a single call or message came through from any family member, a strange silence, given that I expected at least one to try contacting me from a different number. Perhaps they were finally done trying to get under my skin, or maybe they were merely biding their time until the storm of tension subsided enough for them to reach out again. But just when I thought the chaos had ended. Update 3. About a week had passed, and I'd almost convinced myself that my family would finally cease their relentless intrusions after I'd called the cops on Melissa and Lucas. I was wrong. Once again, they disrupted my solitude. This time, it was my parents at my door, pleading for a moment of conversation. Their demeanors were noticeably more subdued and less arrogant than the defiant airs of Melissa and Lucas, so I reluctantly let them in. But would their visit offer redemption or deepen the wounds? My mother burst into tears as soon as she stepped inside, lamenting how deeply sorry she was for ever having sided with Melissa over me. My father explained, with a heavy heart, that once they learned of Melissa and Lucas's arrest, not only for their disruptive behavior but also for physically shoving me, they found it impossible to view them in the same light. He revealed that they had resolved to cut ties with the two, unable to reconcile their actions with any semblance of family honor. All the while, my mother wept uncontrollably, and my father expressed sincere remorse for having supported Melissa when I was the real victim. But could their contrition mend a bond long shattered by betrayal? I acknowledged their newfound clarity with a curt thanks, but told them it was far too little, too late to salvage what was broken. I had grown used to living life on my own terms and wasn't willing to revert to a dynamic where I placed my family's needs before my own. As much as I appreciated their visit and apology, I couldn't promise to rebuild a relationship that was already in ruins, even if it was with my own parents. Yet the conversation was far from over. They pleaded, insisting that if we tried, perhaps we could mend our ties. But that was exactly the issue. I no longer craved reconciliation. I simply yearned for solitude. I told them that while I respected their efforts, I was utterly done with this drama. Their disappointment was palpable, yet eventually, they left, asking if I could at least unblock them so we might keep in touch. With a heavy heart and a lingering sense of estrangement, I unblocked my parents, even though it felt strangely surreal. And that, I suppose, is where things stand. But as I close this chapter, I wonder, can one ever truly escape the past?